As the bells of St. Paul's chime 6 o'clock, we thank you for joining us tonight for another virtual cocktail hour. As always, you're almost welcome. We really do appreciate your support of these events. I'm delighted to say that from our sales of around 400 signed books from these evenings, we've raised in excess of £4,000 for the Stationers Foundation. So again, thank you very much for your support. It's appreciated. Tonight is our 15th literary evening since we first locked down. But now, of course, we're seeing each other, hopefully face to face, and we have some actual Stationers events coming up. We already had various dinners and lunches in June and July. And since most of us, or some of us, are getting out and about again, maybe even lucky enough to have holidays and getting back to the office, and maybe even a few of us are getting to the pub. The new Stationers year has started. Robert, our new master, kicks off his month with a livery dinner next Wednesday at Cloth Workers Hall, and a lunch we have in October at Plasterers Hall. So hopefully, many of you will be able to attend at least one or both of these events. Tonight, however, we have the pleasure to welcome two of our old friends, two of the old friends of the Stationers Company, Peter Day, who most of you know, and most of you also know David Meara, who's our ex-chaplain and has set the very, very high standard for graces that we've had in recent years. David, which some of you might not know, is also an author of several books. And we'll hear about that this evening, about an exciting new publication which will be available to order at the end of this. So more about that later. So please sit back, charge your glasses, and enjoy Peter Day in conversation with David Meara. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, this evening we're hearing from David Meara, the Reverend David Meara, formerly Archdeacon, the Venerable David Meara. We don't have many venerables on these chats. He'll be talking about himself as a priest and writer, in particular about his forthcoming book about the late Sir John Betjeman. I've got a bit here. There's the cover of it. A Passion for Places. This is a preview because the book itself is not going to be published until November the 15th, I think, David. That's anyway, right. I already know that David has been involved in churches for most of his life. He's probably well known to many of us, as Mike says, as a former chaplain of the Stationers, when he was rector of St. Bride's, Fleet Street, from 2000 to 2014, and sang, or rather rhymed for his supper by composing those graces for Stationers' dinners. A reminder, your questions are welcome via the chat function. They'll be passed to me by Diana, so I don't have to squint at the bottom of the screen all the time. So let's start by talking about you, David, not the book. You're zooming in from where this evening?
Hello, Peter, and hello, everybody. It's good to see some familiar faces on the screen. I'm zooming in from Kidlington, Oxford, where I retired to, golly, 7 years ago now.
But of course, you've got a strong Oxford diocese, Oxfordshire connection, haven't you?
I have. I was actually born in Oxford in 1947. But only lived here for about 3 years, and then we moved to London and then to Pinner in Middlesex. But I came back here to university. I served in the Oxford diocese for 27 years before I moved to St. Bride's in London. So yes, lots of sort of sentimental and family links with Oxford and Oxfordshire.
You went to Merchant Taylor's School, a boarding school with a chapel, of course, and then Oxford. You've got a taste for places of worship, which you're writing about in this new book, places of worship from an early age.
Yes, I did. When my brother and I were young, we used to go out into, living in Pinner, we were in striking distance of the Chiltern Hills. So we drive out my mother would drive us out in the holidays, take a picnic and go and wander around some of the Chiltern churches. And that started from about the age of 10, I should think. So from a very early age, I got a real love of churches and church architecture. Although actually at that stage, the family were worshipping in our local Presbyterian church. So I didn't have any worshipping connection with the Church of England at that point at all. That only came later on in my university years, when I was seriously thinking about the possibility of ordination.
You were a sort of very early church bagger. Other people went off and spotted trains in your generation, I suppose, but you spotted churches.
Yes, I was never a train spotter, but I always loved railways and trains and train travel, just like John Betjeman did. But yes, my early interest was in churches. Actually, my real interest in going into churches in those early days was brass rubbing. If some of you of a certain age will remember that back in the 1960s and early 70s, brass rubbing was a national pastime. Lots of children and adults used to do it. And there were also, not as well as rubbing brasses, monumental brasses in churches, there were brass rubbing centres all around the country. So it was a really popular hobby. And that's what got me really going into churches. And I suppose my interest in church architecture grew from that.
And of course, nowadays it's much more difficult to rub brasses because it's regarded as a damaging pastime, isn't it? So they have reproductions of the brasses you can rub, but you can't rub the actual brasses.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it's interesting how that hobby, which actually goes back to the mid-19th century or even earlier, but really did take off in the late Victorian and into the Edwardian period, but then carried on and now has completely gone. Not only are brasses probably carefully guarded by churches now, and people aren't normally allowed to rub them, but also you can't get the detailed paper that you need, because as some of you involved in the paper industry will know, with the advent of computers, large rolls of paper have sort of gone out of fashion now.
The Daily Express in the 1930s, I think, used to make it mandatory for its reporters to carry the heel ball, the cobbler's heel ball, the black heel ball, so that if they got to a place where something awful had happened that had a brass plate outside it, they could take a rubbing, even though there was no photographer there, and bring that back with them when they went back to head office in Fleet Street to write their reports. And it gave the Daily Express a little bit of a beat over the other papers.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I didn't know that.
So brass rubbing can get you anywhere. Why did you decide to become a priest, though? You didn't have that upbringing from family, but you got it as soon as you went to school in university.
Yes, I suppose when I was at school, the school chapel, there was a school, an Anglican school chaplain, and I got involved there. I got involved in the chapel at college at Oriel when I was up at Oxford University. And gradually, I think, I'd also, as I've said, had this background of interest in churches and church life. And when I was coming to the end of my degree, which was in classics, and thinking about what career to pursue, what to do, it came to me that, well, one strong inner feeling was you've got to sort of pursue this idea of a call to ministry. And that's what I did. Asked around, talked to the chaplain, saw the director of ordinands in the diocese, and that led to me going forward to do a second degree in theology and to train at Cuddesdon Theological College. And then I was ordained in 1973.
And then you had quite a lot of parish positions, of parish priest positions.
Yes, I stirred my curiosity in Reading, and then I went to do a stint at the University of Reading as their chaplain, which was great fun, very stimulating and exciting. And then I moved to Berkshire, to 3 rural parishes, and after that to Buckingham, to be rector of Buckingham. Excuse me. And from Buckingham, I came down to St Bride's here in London.
take a drink. Of course, Reading University is one of the great centres of type in the world, isn't it? So
yeah,
there was a sort of type connection then,
yeah.
and studying topography. The move, though, to London and to St. Bride's must have been quite a big change. This was, this was sort of quite well on in your working life too.
Yes, it was. Excuse me, frog in the throat.
Don't choke on this.
This is gin and tonic, by the way. Johnny, nice
Oh, right. Oh well, maybe that's why you're spluttering.
Now,
Right.
Peter, steady, steady.
Okay, are you better now?
Yeah. I had no background at all in the media world, in the world of newspapers, which of course is very much part of the ministry at St. Bride's. But I was very happy in Buckingham as rector there. And then one Saturday morning, I was phoned up out of the blue by one of the canons of Westminster Abbey, who are patrons of St. Bride's. And they said, we're looking for a new rector. Your name's been mentioned. Are you interested in pursuing it? And when that sort of thing happens, you either say, that's very nice to have been thought of, but thanks, but no thanks. Or you say, well, yeah, well, I don't know much about this, but I'll give it a go and see where we get to. And that's what I did. And I ended up being appointed. And I had really the 14 best years of my ministry, I think, here in London at St. Bride's, because it was a wonderful church to be part of, a fascinating, multifaceted ministry, still plenty of links with the media world, even though all the newspapers had scattered across London. I don't think there was a single major newspaper left in Fleet Street by the time I arrived. They'd all gone in John Oates's time. But in spite of that, in spite of Fleet Street becoming a virtual village rather than an actual village, in a way, the newspaper groups and the media organizations valued their links with St. Bride's even more, because particularly journalists of a certain age remembered Fleet Street of the 40s, 50s and 60s, and loved going back there, loved keeping their links with the street. And we were one of the reasons for them coming back, and they'd come back to memorial services or special occasions or carol services and feel that they were still connected to the beating heart, the spiritual heart of the media world.
And of course, the links with the big newspaper companies helped enormously after the war, because St. Bride's was bombed during the war, and a great reconstruction then took place. In fact, completely reorganizing the way the church looked and was. It wasn't a replication of what had been there before, quite, was it?
No, the church, obviously, as you will know, was bombed in the war in 1940. But it wasn't. It was a firebomb, so it didn't sort of smash everything to bits, but it burnt down the roof. The walls were still standing, and it remained a ruin throughout the war years. And then because it was in the middle of the newspaper world, Fleet Street said, "This is our church. We want to restore it, repair it. We don't want to just leave it as a ruin." And they rallied round and very marvelously raised the money to make the restoration of it possible. And it was reopened with great fanfare with the Queen and Prince Philip present in 1957.
And from the architectural point of view, the interior architecture point of view, like a chapel, a sort of chapel layout.
Yes, the architect was Godfrey Allen, who was the surveyor to the fabric of St. Paul's Cathedral. In other words, the architect who managed the fabric at St. Paul's. And he was given the task of redesigning St. Bride's. And he designed it a bit like a college chapel, with stalls facing inwards, which some people think is a rather odd design, because it wasn't like that before. It was the traditional pews all facing eastwards. But he did it quite deliberately, because he thought in those immediate post-war years, that part of London largely depopulated, not many people, therefore, to form a core congregation. He felt that was a way, if people were sitting facing each other, looking at each other, they might get to know each other. That would build a sense of community and help the church to flourish and to grow.
But in fact, this dealing with a smaller congregation turned out to be, well, it's kind of too small now, isn't it?
Well, St. Bride's is one of the churches in the city. There are 38 churches in the square mile. Not all of them have Sunday congregations. Some of them are really just weekday churches. St. Bride's is one of those that ever since, well, all the way through, has had a Sunday congregation. And Cyril Armitage, the vicar, after the war, really built that up. He started the professional choir, and therefore the music has always been very splendid, a real USP. And that has meant that the congregation, it's a pretty eclectic one, but it has over the years grown. And certainly during my time, you know, on a Sunday morning, you regularly get congregations of 100, 120 people, which is, you know, pretty good going, really.
And you actually raised more money. You had another very successful, or two successful appeals on your watch to actually make the people on the outer sort of ring less far away than they had been when the church was originally rebuilt.
Yes, when I arrived and we looked at the accounts and so on, we realised that the what was called the Restoration Fund, which was really the residue from the money that was raised to rebuild the church, and because the newspapers and others had been so generous all those years ago, there was still a substantial residue that had helped the church with its income, that helped to pay for the choir and the music and so on. But that was running out. And so I thought, well, we better take the bull by the horns. And this was 2003. We launched a re-endowment appeal. And the target was 3.5 million, which was a pretty ambitious target, but we did raise it with a lot of help from our traditional core supporters, the media world, the local commercial firms that have moved in.
The rise of the accountants are in and around Fleet Street.
Absolutely, yes.
Happening on your watch.
People like Goldman Sachs and Freshfields, Lovells, who now, you know, populate all the office spaces around about, and also, but our friends in the livery world, etc., etc. And with a good following wind and a good team, we achieved our target. So that re-endowed the church, and it, in particular, has enabled us to maintain the excellence of the music. And actually, during these last years of the 2 years of the pandemic, has been a godsend, because we've been able to, or Alison has been able to keep the choir, even though they haven't been able to be singing on a regular basis.
And then, they do sing "I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles" quite wonderfully once a year with the stationers. Absolutely. And during that service, or just before, the court goes down into the crypt and we put our gowns on, and that's an extraordinary thing too, the crypt of St. Bride, isn't it? Going back, what, to Roman times down there? It
does, goes back to Roman times, and the irony is that it probably would have lain undiscovered, maybe not forever, but certainly for a lot longer, if the bombs hadn't fallen. Because when the rebuilding work was going to start, in came the archaeologists, and they discovered these sealed vaults under the church, which everybody had forgotten about. Didn't know they were there. And of course, in the vaults, as you, I'm sure, well know, are hundreds and thousands of bones from not only the medieval period, but also the 17th and 18th centuries in the charnel houses.
The other link with the stationers, apart from you becoming chaplain of the stationers, is Wynkyn de Worde, who lived in and ran his press, didn't he, in the what is effectively the churchyard of St. Bride's.
He set his press
and
up.
He was, of course, a proud stationer. We're proud of him, which Caxton never was. So it's a very, very interesting link to. I know there are a lot of other literary and print links, but it's a very strong one, that is.
Yes, he set his press up at the sign of the sun at a corner of the churchyard of St. Bride's. And there is, probably if you've noticed, there is at the west end of the church on the wall a lovely plaque to Wynkyn de Worde, recording his, the first printer of Fleet Street, which was designed and engraved by our friend Leda Kindersley at her workshop in Cambridge. Well,
a member of the famous Kindersley publishing and engraving family, of course.
Yeah, yeah.
There's not just her, is there? Later on at St. Bride's, you became Venerable, the Archdeacon of London, a Church of England bureaucrat, as well as doing the priest job.
Yes. In 2009, I think, Bishop Richard Charters asked me if I would be Archdeacon of London. And I said yes. I asked him if I could carry on as rector of St. Bride's, because I knew I had a good team there. I knew what I was doing. I didn't really want to the bishop wanted me to take on a smaller city church. But I said, no, I don't want to start two jobs at once. Let me stick with St. Bride's and I'll do the archdeaconry work, which wasn't quite as onerous as it sounds, because Archdeacon of London is a very, very ancient title, but realistically now I was responsible for the square mile and the city and the 38 grade 1 listed buildings within it, which was a wonderful heritage, wonderful task to have, and also making links, working with the city corporate, the Livery world and so on. So it made sense for me to stay at St. Bride's and do that job, which is, as you say, a largely bureaucratic job. It's they always say that the archdeacon is the bad man to the bishop's good man. The bishop can be the kind of jolly, friendly, we're all in it together. The archdeacon's got to kind of sort the messes out. He's the kind of the legal officer, a bit of a disciplinary work, that sort of thing. I remember when. Do you remember whether you did you watch the program Rev when it was on? Simon McBurney, the actor, played the archdeacon in that show, and he phoned me up before the show when they were doing rehearsals to say, "Tell me what an archdeacon does. How should I play this?" And I said, "You've got to be the nasty one, really, because that's the kind of sort of in comedy terms, that's the role you've got to play, a foil to the bishop."
But you could do nasty, could you?
Not very well, no.
Because it's a problematic, or a job full of problems, because the number of churches in the city. I know that actual people living in the city, there are more of them now than there have been for a long time, but nevertheless far too many churches for the area and far too many splendid churches. What do you do with them? That's sort of at the back of your mind all the time.
Well, when Bishop Richard was made Bishop of London, there'd just been a report called the Templeman Report, which recommended basically that most of the city churches should be closed, mothballed. And the
Four open or something like that it was, I think. Very, very few left.
Yes, there should be a sort of the city was, the plan was to divide the city into quadrants and to have one kind of lead church in each, and really almost forget about the rest. And Bishop Richard, when he was made Bishop of London, said, absolutely not. No city church is going to close on my watch. So one of my jobs was to make sure that we found roles for these buildings, and perhaps more importantly, an income stream to make them financially viable and to wash their face, so that they weren't a drain on the diocese. And on the whole, we did succeed in that pretty well, and it was a fun and fascinating task.
And what about you and the stationers? How did you get the job of chaplain?
Well, John Oates, my predecessor, had been chaplain before me, and I think when I was appointed at St Bride's, the stationers, after a suitable sort of pause, invited me up, looked me over, and to see whether my face fitted. And thank goodness they said yes, because it was one of the real joys of the job for me to be chaplain at Stationers' Hall. Firstly, because it was very near; it was just a quick walk up the hill. Secondly, because it's a beautiful hall, and thirdly, because the stations themselves were such lovely people. I think of all the livery companies that I had links with, if there was a stationers event, a dinner, a lunch, or whatever, that's the one I really did look forward to, because I knew it would always be a good occasion.
That's very nice of you to say so. I'm sure you're not just saying it because here we are on the stationers'
No,
Zoom
I'm not. No.
ticket, but
No, it's said from the heart.
Anyway, let's go to the book now. Victorians. Betjeman was very keen, wasn't he, on Victorian architecture, and you say that Victorian architecture and Victorian churches shaped very much not just buildings, but the way we think about the Church of England, about religion. Yes,
I think, I mean, Betjeman loved Victorian and Edwardian architecture. He also loved Georgian architecture. He rather tended to champion things that other people thought, weren't much cop. But your point about Victorian churches, I think, is a good one, because if you think what most people think of as a church interior, that's a rather big nave, and then a sort of division, a chancel, a screen or an arch, perhaps some steps, and then a chancel, a long space where the choir would sit, and then at the far end the sanctuary. Perhaps quite a lot of decoration, and this, when you go into a church, you talk in whispers, and it's a holy space. Now that, in a way, is very largely a Victorian idea. That's the image the Victorians have left us.
What did we do before then? It was much more milling around, was it?
In the 18th century, churches were places where you listened to the sermon on the whole. If you've been in an 18th century church with box pews, a huge 3-decker pulpit, it was an auditory space where you listened, not where the communion service was celebrated. And before that, in medieval times, the nave was the space for the village community. That was the communal space, and all sorts of things would happen in there. Village fairs, marriages in the porch, etc., etc. And it was only really the chancel, divided by the screen, where that was the holy bit. But that sense of the church being the community space where all sorts of things happened, that really all went out with the Victorians. The whole building became a holy space where you talked in hushed whispers, and where the surplice choir sang the offices from the chancel.
Now, your previous books have been about very particular details of church architecture, of church interior architecture, the brasses.
Yeah.
2 or 3 books on brasses, I think.
Yes.
Why did you then now decide to write a book about John Betjeman, a completely, a much, much wider subject?
Why, yes, but clearly churches are a very important part of what John Betjeman wrote about. But I suppose mainly because John Betjeman is one of my heroes. He is one of the reasons that I got church crawling, visiting churches when I was a boy and a teenager. His Collins Guide to English Parish Churches had come out in 1958. And then in the early 60s, he did some television programs. He was one of the first sort of telly personalities. And he did a series called An ABC of Churches, when he went around visiting churches, starting with A, which was Aldbourne in Wiltshire, and then like Broxbourne, etc., etc. And that really captivated me. And I remember distinctly watching him in one of these programs. He was standing at the church porch, looking into the building, and then he turned to the camera and he said, "Come in, follow me." And as a boy, I was sort of captivated by that. I thought, there's John Betjeman actually asking me to come and discover the excitement and the riches that he knows are inside that building. And that got me hooked. And ever since, I've really enjoyed his approach to looking at buildings, not just churches, but the whole of the built environment. And one reason for writing the book was because he's a hero of mine. Another, perhaps more profound reason, is that I think his way of looking at buildings is in danger of being forgotten, because the art historians, the architectural historians, have rather occupied his territory now and write very good and very worthy and technically detailed books about buildings, the built environment, churches, led by the great figure of Professor Nicolaus Pevsner. Many of you will know that name. Pevsner's Buildings of England is a series that was started in the wartime years and has subsequently run to cover the whole of England. It's been extended to cover Wales and Ireland and Scotland. The volumes have been reprinted and enlarged, and they have a worldwide international reputation. Pevsner was a bit of a bête noire for dear old Betjeman, mainly because Betjeman felt that Pevsner, with his Germanic categorizing approach to things, absolutely killed them stone dead. He wanted people to imagine the building as a place where people, real people, were, whether it was a town hall or a church or whatever. And a bit like looking at a picture, he wanted to go into the picture and see it coming alive. And he thought that sort of Pevsnerian tradition of just sort of talking about arches and squints and perpendicular tracery and all the rest of it actually killed the whole subject stone dead. And of course, Pevsner's Buildings of England series really put the kibosh on the series that he'd begun, which is the Shell Guides to England, which started in 1934, were very successful, killed off slightly by the war. They did restart afterwards, but by then, Pevsner's series had got underway and was really occupying the main space. Pevsner put his tanks on Betjeman's lawn, and Betjeman didn't like it.
That's a very interesting way of putting it. Anyway, this is an attempt to rehabilitate or to bring Betjeman back into the overall picture of places, of the way we look at places.
Yes, and I mean the book's called A Passion for Places because it's not just my passion, but it was certainly John Betjeman's passion, and it's a sort of, I'm afraid I've used, he in the 1970s, he did another TV documentary called A Passion for A Passion for Churches, which was largely based on East Anglia and Norfolk, the diocese of Norfolk of Norwich. So I kind of used that title and broadened it to cover the whole of the built environment, really.
I think there's a story of Benjamin doing, he also did the landscape from the air. They used helicopters to film the landscape from the air, and he was up in the helicopter, although how he could commentate in a helicopter, I don't know. Maybe they did that later. But anyway, he did, when the helicopter got a bit lost, he could tell the pilot where to go, navigating by churches throughout the landscape.
That's right,
A splendid story. Anyway, how have you gone about this? How do you take a subject like this and break it up into chapters of a book?
Well, what I did, because those of you who know anything about Betjeman will know that there's an awful lot been written about him. You know, a great big 3-volume biography, books about his, obviously his poetry, and so on. And you might well say, well, what is there really a need for yet another book? My focus is quite specifically on the topographical writings. And he wrote quite a lot. Well, he wrote a lot, and he also gave a lot of talks. So what I've done is to do it roughly chronologically, starting with his boyhood, his love of Cornwall, when he went down to Trebetherig for family holidays as a child, his love of Oxford, where he went up but was then ignominiously sent down because he failed Divers, the divinity examination. London, because he loved London, and he lived, as you know, he lived in the city. In
Cloth Fair.
In Cloth Fair, just round the corner from St. Bart's the Great. Middlesex, which was his sort of favourite London county. And then Middlesex and Metroland. He did a famous, again, another TV documentary called Metroland in about 1972, which is a marvel. You can still get hold of it. It really is worth watching.
And then perhaps the best thing he ever did, actually. But
I think it is. I think it is. And then finally Norfolk, where, as I say, he loved Norfolk. His father took him there as a boy to go sailing on the Norfolk Broads, and he loved Norfolk all his life. And then finally, just a sort of final chapter to wrap it up on when he was an old man, looking back on his life and able to sort of reflect really on the things that really mattered to him.
All through his writings, but not an anthology. This is you writing about his writings.
Yes, no, it's not an anthology. I mean, I do quote bits from him, obviously, but it really is as I say, my thesis is that as far as his sort of battle with Nicolaus Pevsner is concerned, he lost the battle, because you can't buy the Shell guidebooks now. You can only buy them in second-hand bookshops. But the Buildings of England series has gone from strength to strength. So he lost the battle, but I think he won the war, in that our understanding of the importance of a subjective approach to things, an intuitive approach to things, a more romantic approach to things has come right back in. And in a way, that's exactly the way Betjeman wanted us to see things, to see buildings, to see churches as living places, populated by people with, a huge, rich story to tell.
Have you got examples of these from the various places in the book, from Cornwall, for example?
Well, Cornwall, when he went on holiday to Trebetherig, the churches nearby, St. Enodoc, which is, of course, where he's buried. It's a lovely church in the middle of the golf links, was almost buried by sand, the sand blowing in, and was then rediscovered. Blisland, just inland a bit, one of his favourite churches. So yes, those are his sort of Cornish delights. In Oxford, when he was a young lad in Oxford, he used to go round, he went to the Dragon School, and one of the masters there sort of took him under his wing and took him bicycling around churches. So he knew Oxford churches and the Oxford City churches very well. In London, St. Bart's the Great was one of his absolute favourites, and he used to attend evensong there regularly. And then there's a whole, in my chapter which covers Norfolk, there are a whole series of churches, largely the ones that feature in his Norfolk film, A Passion for Churches. And I should say that it's not just letterpress, this book. There are 100 photographs that really, because it's the images that really bring it to life. So the pictures are almost as important as the text in giving you a sort of sense of the Betchamanic way of looking at things.
And of course, that was one of the particular things about the Shell Guides, was the combination of pictures by people like John Piper, not drawings, but actual wonderful Piper photographs in black and white, were extremely powerful, mixed with the words and the choice of places, and they were a very powerful combination at the time.
They were really when John Piper and John Betjeman met in the 1930s and became firm friends, and it was John Piper's influence on Betjeman, as well as Betjeman's influence on John Piper, actually, that really made a huge difference to Betjeman, his way of looking at things, the way he planned and wrote or got other people to write the Shell Guides. And you're quite right, the photography, Piper was a very good photographer. And for instance, his Shell Guide to Oxfordshire, which is called Oxon, has got some wonderful black and white photographs in it. And Piper was a much more, Betjeman was a sort of very unsystematic, chaotic sort of person. John Piper was much more organized. He'd go around with a notebook, he'd take notes, he'd go into churches and buildings, he'd take notes, do little drawings, and then use those as the basis for the guide. So Piper was a huge influence on John Betjeman for the better, and he became the general editor of the Shell Guides, and they improved enormously under his editorship.
Of course, Betjeman left Oxford early, but he did receive what he kind of thought of, I think, as a university education by writing for the Architectural Review, which was in those days a very remarkable magazine indeed, and took architecture very seriously indeed.
It did.
In all sorts of ways, not just building and builders and contractors and architects, but the whole ethos of the built environment, as it's now called.
It was edited by a very interesting man called Hubert the Cronin Hastings, and Hastings took on Betjeman, who was regarded as a slightly frivolous character, but it was during his architecture, he called it the Archie Rev, and during that period he flirted with modernism. Amazingly, Betjeman actually enjoyed some of the modernist architecture that was being built in the early 30s, as indeed did John Piper. But both men very soon left that behind. But the Architectural Review was a very good, as you say, a good school really for Betjeman, and made him a lot of contacts and enabled him to see the range of architecture and design that was being built at the time.
And of course, out of the Architectural Review later on came Ian Nairn, who, in a way, very un-Betjemanesque, but kept going this human response to buildings in a absolutely movingly passionate way sometimes. That extraordinary film where Nairn is in the pulpit of the church in Bolton, is it, and begins to cry on camera at what is the wreckage in front of him. I've never seen anything like that on television. Yeah. That's the same sort of spirit.
Yes, you say that Ian Nairn was, whom I mention in the book, that he was un-Betjemanesque. Actually, I think he was very much in the spirit of Betjeman, because, as you say, he had this very emotional, intuitive almost artist's response to the environment. And of course, Ian Nairn worked on the Surrey and Sussex volumes of the Buildings of England series, but left significantly. He told Pearson that he wasn't going to be involved anymore. And one of the reasons, the main reason he gave, was that it was becoming too catalogy, too much detail, and not enough sense of the spirit of place.
Rather,
So I think Ian Nairn is actually a real sort of took up the spirit of Betjeman very much, in the way that someone like Gavin Stamp did as well.
who, of course, did Betjeman's job at Private Eye under the Pelotti byline.
That's right.
After Benjamin died.
Yeah. Yes.
Betjeman died. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And was always a great scourge of the Church of England for you know, if he thought that we were disregarding or mistreating the churches in our care.
Now, Metroland was an extraordinary film and sort of brought into existence something that had been there all the time, but people had forgotten about, didn't it?
Yes, and you know, I've got sort of, as they say, skin in the game here, because I grew up in Metroland. From the age of about 4, I lived in Pinner, and you can't get much more Metroland than Pinner.
We better explain to everybody that this is the towns, villages, landscape opened up by the Metropolitan line.
Yes, the Metropolitan Railway, very, very cannily, when they expanded their lines out of London into through Middlesex up into Buckinghamshire, they bought up land, not just to run their lines on, but land either side of the railway lines. I mean, quite substantial amounts of land, so that they then could sell this off for housing. The houses would go up, the people would live in the houses, who would then need to use the Metropolitan line to get back to their jobs in London. And in the 1920s and 30s, living in Metroland was an aspirational dream for London middle classes who had perhaps lived in very cramped accommodation, much nearer to the centre of London itself. And indeed, my own parents, I think, followed that aspirational dream in that they lived in London for a bit, but then bought their own house in a community where they could be part of a community, and where they'd have space and a nice garden and access to countryside. And that was very much the aspirational dream of that period. And Betjeman rather loved that. The film itself basically takes the Metropolitan line as the kind of spine of the film, and you follow the line out, looking at various interesting and quirky places along the way, until finally, at the end of the film, he reaches Verney Junction, which is where the Metropolitan line was supposed to go, but never actually got to. And he looks around in this very, very rural environment and says, the Metropolitan line never reached this far. Grass triumphs. And you know, I'm rather glad. And that was the end of the film.
Because there's poetry in the film too, isn't there?
Sorry?
There's poetry in the film too.
The script is a sort of blank verse script, yes, which Betjeman was very good at. I can't offhand quote any of it to you, but you know, you can still get the Metroland video or the DVD, and it really is absolute delight.
But I wanted to ask whether you got poetry, or whether you consider poetry as part of, you must do, as part of his writing about places.
Yes, but I mean, I mentioned some of the poems. He wrote a number of poems, for instance, about Middlesex, about Harrow. Betjeman went to Marlborough School, and he hated it. He wasn't at all sporty, so he had a pretty rough time there. And he always rather fancied that he really should have gone to Harrow. So he wrote quite a lot about Harrow. He wrote a lot of programs about the school song, and Harrow features in some of his poetry. And I do mention the poetry, but because so many people have written about the poetry, I've rather more concentrated more on his prose writing and his radio talks, of which he gave many hundreds.
Something I do remember about him is he was very uncomfortable with his father, who was in trade, wasn't he? I think he had a small factory in Pentonville Rise in Islington, where his father made something called the tantalizer, which was a device that you locked round your wines, your spirits, in the drawing room, so that the servants couldn't get at them. Yes,
it was called a tantalus.
Oh, tantalus, yes, yeah.
And yes, it sort of kept safe the whiskey and the port or whatever, so that the servants couldn't take a sly pinch. Yes, Betjeman's father ran this. It was a sort of quite a high class firm that made objects for the home, but of course it was trade. And Betjeman, I suppose you would say he probably was a snob in a way. When he was at Oxford, he quickly made friends with the aristocratic set, and he clearly felt really at home with them. He made lots of very good friends, lifelong friends. And the fact that his father was in trade was something I think he found deeply shaming and embarrassing. It doesn't, I'm afraid, reflect very well on him, but you know, that's so typical, I think, of a teenage boy. And yet his father loved him. He wasn't very demonstrative. He, as I say, he took him sailing in Norfolk. He encouraged him in his interest in architecture, bought him books related to that. But their relationship was always very strained and pretty problematic.
Well, Venerable, we got a bit away from churches. Did he have a favourite church, Betjeman?
Well, I think his favourite church, or two churches, were probably St. Protus and St. Hyacinth, Blisland, which I mentioned already, and St. Enodoc at Trebetherig, which is where he's buried. Those Cornish churches, which I think really nurtured his interest in churches. And you've got to remember that he first came across them, like I first came across churches, when he was a boy, aged sort of 8, 9, 10. And that's when their powerful effect began to work on him. And one of the things I've done in the book is to just intersperse little bits of autobiography, bits about me and my love of churches, because so much of what I love and have enjoyed through my life are echoes, really, of what John Betjeman loved. So in a way that sort of, I've tried to make it a little bit autobiographical, but not heavily so.
I've got a question from Mike here. I don't know why he wants me to ask it rather than he ask it, but he says, did you ever meet John Betjeman?
Sadly, no. I've been at a couple of lectures, I think, that he gave way back, but I never actually met him on those occasions in person. And yes, that's a great sadness. I wish I had. I mean, everyone who ever met John Betjeman, I think, always found him the most wonderful, warm character, full of life, full of laughter. All the pictures of him show him, apart from those last years of his life when he suffered from Parkinson's, show him roaring with laughter. You know, an evening with John Betjeman must have been a really fun occasion.
And Michael Clark asked whether you consider that Victorian influence on churches and church architecture a positive thing.
I personally do. I think John Betjeman was one of those, Kenneth Clark was another, who in the 1930s and onwards, when Victorian architecture was really looked down on, and a lot of it was actually being demolished and got rid of. John Betjeman.
That's what Nairn is mourning when he stands in the pulpit in Bolton, yes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, John Betjeman was a great supporter, a great campaigner. For Victorian architecture, he was one of the founder members of the Victorian Society. He loved all these forgotten names, these forgotten Victorian architects, and the churches and the buildings that they built. And he thought we should really regard them better. And I think now the wheel has turned, because I think now we do appreciate Victorian architecture for itself, and you know, find that it's an important part of our built environment. And it's to a large degree thanks to John Betjeman that change of attitude has happened.
And the things that go on in church that you say were so influenced by the way the Victorians thought about church services, for example, that was entirely a good thing. After all, St. Bride's isn't very Victorian in the way it operates, is it? No.
I think in those terms, maybe the Victorians put a bit of a dead hand on the way we look at churches and worship in church. And again, in a funny way, things are changing now, because now that so many churches are becoming being used as community assets again, and this is happening all across the country, not just for worship, but for concerts, for meetings, for lectures, for children's groups, all the rest of it. They're being adapted, kitchens are being put in, toilets are being put in, so that they can become 7-day-a-week facilities, not just open for an hour on a Sunday and then locked up again. In a way, that Victorian attitude is we're sort of turning our backs on that and saying, no, that doesn't work anymore. You know, we've got to, in a sense, regain that more medieval approach that sees the church, particularly the nave, as a community space that everyone can use in all sorts of different ways.
And yet there is some kind of ministry and it's a bit idolatrous if you get to worship buildings too much, but there is some kind of ministry in the building itself, isn't there? When you have open churches, the comments that people write in the visitors book about getting into a space which is quiet and peaceful and reflective, not particularly religious, but deeply answering some kind of deep felt need, apparently.
Yes, and Betjeman felt that very, very strongly. He felt churches were sacramental places, you know, outward and visible signs where something much deeper and more spiritual could be encountered. There was a program with him and the poet Philip Larkin, who wrote a very famous poem called Churchgoing, which some of you may know. Larkin himself was an agnostic and slightly cynical, I think. But I think the lines he wrote to end that poem, Churchgoing, are so good and so resonant. He said, "A serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destinies, and that much never can be obsolete." And that sense of a serious house where all our most inner compulsions, needs, thoughts, desires are somehow able to be recognized and met. That's something John Betjeman felt very profoundly.
I have to say, though, some people may say that Betjeman's writings are steeped in a sort of melancholy nostalgia for the past, which, if we look at it from well into the 21st century, is a sort of Brexit view of Britain.
Yes. Betjeman himself wanted to reclaim the word nostalgic. He said in an article in The Spectator in 1954, nostalgic is a scientific word for sentimental and sounds like a form of catarrh. I regard nostalgic as a term of praise myself, for it implies reverence and a sense of the past and an awareness of, though not necessarily slavery to, tradition. I would agree with that. And interestingly, not so long ago in the Times, one of their columnists, a chap called James Marriott, who's a relative youngster, wrote an article about nostalgia. And he ended, just to re-quote what he ends by saying, "We're all stranded in time. The present in which we are so frequently advised to live is our pasts are richer, more filled with lessons and associations and meaning. We should spend more time there."
And that's what you're helping us to do, you say, with this book.
It is indeed. It is, okay, call it nostalgic, but I would be a great supporter of a good dose of nostalgia.
Thank you ever so much, David. I can't let you go without your being given a chance to explain what the bells hanging behind you are. The handbells, what are they doing there?
That's a set of handbells that Rosemary and I thought over a period of time from the Whitechapel Bell Foundry, that wonderful bell foundry in the East End of London that is sadly late lamented indeed. We bought them with a sort of fond hope that our children, as a family, we would ring the handbells. Never quite worked out like that, but we have rung them on occasions, and we certainly, when I was at St. Bride's, we used them every Christmas Sunday morning. We'd have them and get volunteers up, and we'd ring Christmas carols on them. And we still take them down and do that sort of thing now. But they're lovely objects just in their own right. And as you say, a sad, nostalgic reminder now of a great London institution that is no more.
Well, time is up. Thank you very much, David Meara, for that preview of your new book, which is A Passion for Places, all about John Betjeman and his lifelong love of places and buildings, out in November, as Mike will tell us. Mike.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you, guys. I mean, that was just an excellent conversation between two such nice and talented individuals. I mean, there were times during that conversation I could almost hear that wonderful voice of John Betjeman, and I can remember Metroland is such a great television program. David, you've had such an interesting and varied life. And I don't know if you remember that when you stopped becoming chaplain for us, I actually had the pleasure of interviewing you to join the stations company, and we really value your membership. So thank you very much. And we're so lucky to have people like David and Peter. As Peter said, David's new publication is A Passion for Places. Hopefully will be available in November. It will make an excellent Christmas gift. If you'd like to pre-order, then David will personally dedicate and sign those books. So please contact either Lucy or myself. The cost will be $15.99. We're not giving change, so it's going to be £16. And there'd be £3 post and packaging if you can't pick it up from the office. It's bound to be an excellent read. I know it's beautifully illustrated. I mean, last month, those that joined us for the Wilbur Smith Foundation might be interested to know that last night, Rachel Joyce, who wrote Mrs. Benson's Beetle, actually won the acclaimed Adventure Prize. So again, if you haven't bought that book yet, Rachel's very kindly signed some book plates for us, and that book is available for £9. So again, just contact Lucy or myself. Our next cocktail hour is on the 13th of October with John Livery, who is a great-great-grandson of Ludwig Mersel, who founded the gardens at Neiman's. His book, From Refugees to Royalty, has been critically acclaimed, and perhaps is even more relevant in these current times. Perhaps to finish, I could just read one of David's graces that he gave to us some years ago. And I think perhaps the second paragraph actually sums up David's approach to life. The grace read, "Give us a good digestion, Lord, and also something to digest. Give us a well-appointed board with tasty victuals of the best. Give me a sense of humour, Lord. Give me the grace to see a joke, to get some happiness from life and pass it on to other folk." And that's certainly what you do, David. So thank you for joining us tonight. It only remains to say thank you to everybody for joining us tonight. And for me to say to Peter and Lucy, I'll buy you a pint in a minute. Thank you, everybody, and good night.